Thank you very much for the warm welcome. I am so happy to be here. I absolutely love San Diego, and it's an honor and a thrill to have the opportunity to present my research to you today. First, I'd like to sincerely thank Dr. Babak Rahimi for inviting me here and being such a gracious host. Thank you to the Program for the Study of Religion and the Middle East Studies Program for their support for today's talk. Today, I'd like to share with you a project that I've been working on in one form or another for about 6 years. This project has come through a pandemic with me, one that delayed progress for a couple of those 6 years, but now I'm proud to say is well on its way in the data collection phase. The impetus for this research was the realization that many of us, meaning including me, Iranian Americans, really disagree on where we stand in the American racial landscape and the importance or even the existence of the racial landscape at all. As I began reading and investigating and asking more questions, I saw that I wasn't the only one asking questions. That encouraged me. And then we had this massive national uprising here and a racial awakening, a racial reckoning in the US in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd. And that ignited a flurry of conversations and interest among Iranian Americans about who we are, where we stand, and the importance of the questions themselves because of the implications for social solidarity and justice. My earnest hope is that this project can help add momentum to this journey that we're on as a community, and even perhaps to deepen our knowledge about ourselves and one another in support of a more just and free world. The problem, W.E.B. Du Bois said, of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. On the night of the 2016 general election, the late Senator John McCain gave a standard issue victory speech after winning his bid for re-election. He thanked his supporters, acknowledged his challenger, and reaffirmed his commitment to the GOP. Those listening to his speech heard him also extend his gratitude to a perhaps somewhat surprising group, Iranian Americans in Arizona. I lived in Arizona at the time. I was an Iranian American in Arizona. I was a little taken aback. I was listening to the speech intently. He emphasized their importance to his victory, even singling out a few in the room with him during the speech. Of course, they started clapping, and I thought they might break out and dance, but that didn't happen. In light of the demographic characteristics of Iranian Americans as a group, and the generally understood to be hostile character of the GOP platform and rhetoric toward Muslims and Muslim-majority countries, and given McCain's hawkish stance toward Iran, the late senator famously once sang "Bomb, Bomb Iran" to the tune of the Beach Boys song Barbara Ann, and later said he was proud of having done so. Those familiar with McCain and with Iranian Americans as a group may have found the moment somewhat peculiar. I have the clip. If you happen to want to see it later, I can show you. I recorded it. This vignette represents a moment in the history of American race relations vis-a-vis a group which holds an ambiguous status. It presents a crucial opportunity to access and understand the notion of whiteness and the essence of racial identity in the United States, which we can then extend in order to drill down on the role of race and anti-Blackness in Iranian society.
Nice. Mm-hmm.
I think there's somebody in there as well. Which then telescopes out and lands here with the immigrants who joined the Iranian American community. This project hopes to offer an investigation of Iranian American identity, both as understood by Iranian Americans and by society at large, situating the dynamic within the troubled and violent history of the color line and the multifaceted relationship between race, religion, class, ethnicity, and political and institutional access. The study begins with the simple question, are Iranian Americans white? Now, this isn't a brand new question, though it is still very understudied in my view. There's very interesting scholarship broaching this issue, but in my case, I'm not so much interested in the broader question of if we are or not. I'm much more interested in which Iranian Americans believe themselves to be white. Under what conditions are people likely to identify as white, Middle Eastern, Asian, etc.? What correlations can we find between Iranian Americans' racial identification and, for instance, familial ethnic background or religious background, recency of immigration, experiences of discrimination, status as an ethnic or religious minority back in Iran versus here, socioeconomic status, importance or centrality of your ethnic identity to your own sense of self, etc.? We know that Iranian Americans have long occupied a sort of in-between or liminal status that has generated a lot of, let's say, interesting conversations with our family members, with our compatriots in the diaspora. I admit that some of those head-scratching conversations partially inspired this project. We also know that the white racial category in the United States is malleable, capacious, and has a history of adapting to geopolitical and domestic developments in various ways, including accommodating immigrant groups who successfully jump the color line. We even, thanks to important scholarship on this topic, have a general sense of what place Iranian Americans occupy in that racial schema. The short answer is, it really depends. What we don't yet have is data disaggregating Iranian Americans to uncover where exactly those fault lines are. I believe we can't truly get at what factors drive racial identity for Iranian Americans, or really for anyone, until we pull those factors apart. I think it's important to investigate this question, both for what it tells us about this community and what it tells us about the nature of race and the process of racialization. The study of race and migration spans numerous disciplines, tying together fields as varied as political science, sociology, psychology, critical legal studies, and others. All of these approaches contribute valuable frameworks to guide such scholarship. There's a significant body of literature measuring, and assessing acculturation in the field of psychology, much of it pioneered by John Barry. Barry's research theorizes acculturation along four strategies: assimilation, separation, integration, or marginalization. Scholars in the field of positive psychology have built on this work to assess the relationship between acculturation and levels of happiness, for example, among immigrants. While important, all of these fields and all of this research stops just short of investigating potential correlations between various experiences or dimensions of identity and tendencies to identify with whiteness in the United States. There has been vitally important scholarship on the centrality of Blackness in the racial superstructure of the United States. For example, Du Bois, of course, is central. Theodore Allen is another major contributor. And the processes by which immigrant groups initially considered non-white overcame their collective position below the color line to eventually become white. So we're thinking about David Roediger, Noel Ignatieff, Georgie Yancey, O'Brien, Karen Brodkin. However, to date, this body of scholarship still hasn't thoroughly considered the racial status of Iranian Americans within the field of critical race studies and the juxtaposition with Blackness and the color line, nor has the role of anti-Black racism among Iranian Americans been accounted for in analyses of their social and political lives in the United States. In today's presentation, I'm not going in depth into anti-Black racism and other types of Persian chauvinism among non-Black Iranian Americans, but it represents one chapter which will eventually become the book, I hope, that this project is. And I have presented about that particular topic in elsewhere. If you're interested, we can talk about that a little bit later. I'm going to stick on this slide for a second before we go to those two faces. John Tehranian has approached the question of the relative whiteness of Americans of Middle Eastern origin, including Arab Americans and Iranian Americans, in a context of ambiguous racial identity and what he calls, quote, selective racialization. What this means is people who are phenotypically or ethnically ambiguous are racialized only when they transgress cultural norms. For example, Zinedine Zidane for soccer fans in here, or Nomar Garciaparra for baseball fans. Tehranian argues that as a result of their racial and ethnic ambiguity, certain people are subject to selective racialization as Middle Eastern when they engage in quote unquote transgressive behavior, like the infamous Zidane headbutt. Do you remember that? Right, cultural reference that landed, that's awesome. Or if they do not draw attention to their ethnic backgrounds. For example, politician and consumer advocate Ralph Nader, did you know that he's Lebanese origin? Singer and entertainer Cher, Armenian, if you didn't know. Tennis player Andre Agassi, etc. He was more famous in my college days. I don't know if he's still famous now. Reza Ebrahimi outlines the Iranian chauvinism that drives the historical tendency for Iranians to identify with European Aryanness, which has blown a lot of minds, that scholarship, mine included. I think his article about self-orientalization is, if I remember correctly, the most cited in the history of the journal Iranian Studies. His work is really important for understanding Iranian racial formations, but he doesn't apply this to any diasporic Iranian identity, navigating the particular racial schema in their new countries of residence. Thus, the field of critical race studies, again, hasn't yet accounted for the collective racial status of Iranian Americans during a period in which the stakes for this group are high, as the tensions between the US and Iran again escalate. As a result, Iranian Americans are understood as this undifferentiated subgroup within the broader category of Middle Eastern Americans. Even as the United States Census considers adding Middle Eastern and North African to the options provided for self-identification, this group retains its ambiguous racial status, and individuals within it occupy a space between multiple competing identities that have been racialized in the US with respect to country of origin, religious identification, and immigration status. This project assumes as a starting point a fundamentally sociological definition of race. That is to say, racial identity is essentially political, and in the case of Iranian Americans, profoundly contingent. It is at once a biological fiction and a historical fact, a social fact. I'd also like to briefly address the issue of passing. A lot of people have asked me about this. There is a complex set of questions about passing as white and what it means to be a person of color who cannot be immediately identified as such. This project doesn't delve deeply into the literature on passing because in this context, the notion of passing, though important within studies of race and culture, is largely predicated on formal legal constraints, limiting access of people of color to institutions of politics, education, and finance. Moreover, the current iteration of liberal multiculturalism animating the corporate and legal structures of the United States have removed most legal barriers while maintaining a pernicious ongoing process of legitimation of continued systemic inequities. More importantly, the phenomenon of passing doesn't so much apply to Iranian American racial identity because individuals who pass are not disclosing their racial makeup because their phenotypic presentation allows them to assume a certain identity in public. In this case, Iranian Americans aren't omitting any information. They are instead arguing that they belong in the category of whiteness because of their Iranian heritage. There's a long history of immigrant groups in the US arriving as people of color and moving to the other side of the color line to become white. Some people have asked me if I think Iranians are experiencing this shift or this journey right now. In short, maybe. One of the contingencies of group racial identity is global politics. I suspect that Iranians or Iranian Americans who were here prior to the 1979 revolution were less likely to see themselves as Middle Eastern than those who came after the revolution and the ensuing hostage crisis. 9/11, the nuclear confrontation between Iran and the US, and ongoing hostility from the US toward the region overall appears to be sustaining the othering Iranian Americans and other MENA origin Americans are facing. The generational difference in Iranian American racial self-identification is one key question driving this project. I have some preliminary data that I'm going to share in a few minutes, but I need more data. The question of control naturally emerges from the socially inscribed nature of the color line. That is, who or what determines the identity of groups in relation to the color line. If it is socially determined and systemic in nature, is it not possible to change one's place in the racial schema? The answer is reflected in a comment made by Malcolm X to Alex Haley at the airport. Actually, it might have been a train station, now that I'm thinking about it. Upon observing a group of immigrants arriving from Europe dressed in traditional clothing, Malcolm remarks to Haley that the first English word those children will learn is the N-word. Within this exchange is embedded a profound understanding of the historical nature of whiteness. Immigrant groups have a kind of provisional status in the United States until they establish their relationship to Blackness. A group can become white if they are not Black, but they cannot become Black. The notion of whiteness as a political category rather than a biological category has been argued compellingly related to different groups. Noel Ignatieff wrote how the Irish became white. Karen Brodkin has written a lot about how Jews became white. There are many groups applying this model to many scholars applying this model to different groups. But Iranian American racial identity still hasn't been systematically assessed within this particular conceptual framing of whiteness. The idea that Middle Eastern Americans can be white is one that is still under-theorized at the same time that it has in recent years begun entering the popular political imagination. The US Census Bureau brought under consideration, but then rejected the creation of a new category for the 2020 survey, specifically for MENA Americans. Concerns about increased cases of government surveillance among Muslim communities notwithstanding, which are legitimate concerns, the addition of this category raises a theoretical question of the degree to which Middle Eastern and North African Americans are considered to be a separate aggregate racial category. If the population of Americans of Middle Eastern and North African extraction are assessed separately from other racial groups, hypothetically, this could allow for a more targeted allotment of resources to vulnerable groups and a systemic treatment more aligned with social and cultural norms relating to this group. At the same time, the census does not encapsulate the entirety of racial identities of various groups, even as inevitable critical methodological questions arise about how individuals and communities are to be assessed. Various indices of otherness can be taken into consideration. Hate crimes against Muslims and Muslim-adjacent individuals have reportedly spiked since September 11th, 2001, particularly after the election of Donald Trump to the presidency. From the murder of 3 Muslim youth in North Carolina in 2015 to the murder of an Indian man in Kansas and the shooting of a Sikh man in Washington in 2017, as well as the murder of Shoyan Mazrui by a well-known white supremacist gang member in Orange County, just up the freeway here, in 2015, which still hasn't been classified as a hate crime, by the way, and the killing of by National Park Police of Bijan Qaisar in 2017. There has been a wide range of attacks against Muslims and those perceived to be Muslim or other since a new stage of intensification of public hostility began in 2015. Nazitullah Javardi, Castro Oskui, Sahar Aziz, and others have written about the racialization of Muslims in the US, and those studies collectively show that Muslims are subject to varying degrees of racialization as other in response to global events and crises, which reveals again that racialization is a politically contingent process. It is not a simple reflection of biological facts or phenotypical characteristics. It is a profoundly political and social process. In light of the social and political tensions within which Muslim and Muslim-adjacent Americans find themselves, it is perhaps only logical that they would see the attainment of whiteness as a desirable objective. For the Irish, as for other immigrant groups, quote, to enter the white race was a strategy to secure an advantage in a competitive society, from Noel Ignatieff, 2008. This goal seems even more feasible for Iranian Americans upon consideration of the history of Iranian cultural frames around race. The last Shah of Iran, the self-styled, quote, king of kings, light of the Aryans, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, said that Iran was a European country that happened to have the grave misfortune of being stuck in the Middle East. The implication being around all of these Arabs and Afghans and Turks. The myth of an essentially European Aryan identity is pervasive in Iran, and it profoundly shapes the views of Iranian immigrants to the US with respect to their identities and their place in the social fabric of the US. Those views are central and thus, unsurprisingly, highly contested. This brings me to my 2 ignominious case examples here. Jason Reza Georgiani, over here, the former editor-in-chief of alt-right publishing firm Arctos Media and collaborator of prominent neo-Nazi Richard Spencer. You may recognize his name from being in the news, but also he got punched and it became memed. So, you know, currency of memes, I have to reference that. He's an Iranian American self-styled intellectual who argues that Iran represents the first great Aryan civilization that was damaged by white genocide inflicted by the hordes of Arab invaders, his language, not mine, that brought Islam and corrupted the Aryan imperium. White genocide is a phrase invented by white supremacists in reference to what they perceive to be lax immigration policies and intermarriage, which results in the dilution of, quote, the pure white race with the brown other. It is a paranoid fantasy that haunts Giorgiani, along with his compatriots in the ongoing project to purify whiteness, as evidenced by his many writings on the subject on the website he co-founded altright.com, as well as his speeches at various events like the conference of the Right-Wing National Policy Institute. It's a very, very thinly veiled neo-Nazi outfit founded by Richard Spencer. Giorgiani's objective of returning Iranian identity to its exalted place among the great civilizations of Europe is a classic example of Persian chauvinism, wherein historical figures of Iranian and cultural and political development, for example, the ancient kings of Persia like Cyrus, are treated as founders of European Aryan whiteness, while Arabs and Afghans are treated by the likes of Giorgiani as uncivilized barbarians because they are excluded from European whiteness owing to their collective Muslim identity. Giorgiani has aligned himself with the most gauche white supremacist ethos in an attempt to gain standing as a genuine member of the alt-right movement, itself a markedly virulent and neo-Nazi campaign in the current political milieu. Giorgiani is at best a problematic proponent of the Aryan imperium myth. A sober accounting of his ideological positions reveals his enthusiasm for jumping the color line in order to distance himself from people of color in the United States and gain standing as a full-fledged member within the category of whiteness. In fact, Giorgiani's conceptualization of Iran as the first great white civilization and of Arabs as non-white invaders is a political position with a long history in Iran. Rather than being a product of socialization in the United States and its attendant racial hierarchies, racial hostility towards those perceived to be non-white and the embrace of a white identity is not uncommon in Iran. Razavi Ebrahimi's account of Iranian enthusiasm toward a distinctly European notion of Aryan identity takes on even more relevance upon examination of Iran's long history of anti-Black racism. This particular antipathy toward Blackness and embrace of European notions of Aryanness is rooted in the as yet still understudied history of African slavery in Iran. However, if you're interested, Bita Baghoulizadeh is right now, she has a forthcoming book on this subject, which I am eagerly looking forward to.
There's also Parisa Vaziri.
Parisa Vaziri and also Behnaz Mirzai,
Yeah.
yes. While Iranian slavery was different than North American and Latin American slavery in its relatively weaker centrality to the building of an economic foundation, it nonetheless has had extraordinary impact on social relations. As in the United States, there's a racial hierarchy within which whiteness is at the social apex, Blackness is disproportionately disadvantaged or, in fact, erased. In Iran, however, the enslavement of Africans has been whitewashed or erased in order to build an image of a fundamentally harmonious racial landscape. That erasure only serves to obscure the function of anti-Black racism in Iranian society, which then extends to confound Iranian immigrants' perceptions of race when they encounter the particularities of the race relations of the United States. In spite of Giorgiani's ostensibly earnest attempt to gain membership into a movement explicitly predicated on the restoration of whiteness to its position at the apex of the social order, as if it has fallen, right? That's their assumption. The standing of Iranian Americans within the alt-right is precarious at best. Indeed, Giorgiani has had a falling out with Spencer and his neo-Nazi former pals. Matthew Lyons has explored the extensive relationship between the alt-right and the so-called manosphere. This brings us to this dude over here. He likes to be known as Rush V. His name is Dariush Valizadeh, and this is him in his mom's basement in Maryland. He is
Itself is the major issue right there.
He is a sort of men's rights activist and a pickup artist who has embraced the alt-right movement and was initially accepted in return. He has pontificated about the supposedly deleterious effects of Jewish intellectualism on, quote, Western civilization, while clearly situating himself within the realm of Western identity. Valizadeh has made comments about his father's strict Shia Muslim upbringing and has consistently affirmed the lack of discord in his mind between Islam and whiteness. He was in fact embraced by the alt-right until his Iranian American identity came to light, upon which he was denounced as a rapist and a fraud and called, I quote, a greasy Iranian. Remember what I said about contingent whiteness? The moment that this is why passing, right? Very interesting question. This is in keeping with the pattern noted by Tehranian in his argument about selective racialization. In response to his rejection by the group of white nationalists he had befriended, Valizadeh criticized the alt-right as a natural ally of feminism, meant to neuter masculinity and control men's behavior. The case of Valizadeh reflects the by now well-documented locus at which misogyny and white supremacy intersect, and has grown even more, if I may say, bizarre as time has gone on. In recent years, Valizadeh has embraced Orthodox Christianity in a kind of born-again moment, and consequently, he has prohibited on his internet platforms all of the vulgarities on which he built his entire professional identity. It remains to be seen how his followers will respond to this shift. Georgiani and Valizadeh are emblematic of a tendency found within the broader Iranian American community to embrace a deeper Iranian nationalism, one with the peculiar and particular facet of identity that allows them to perceive themselves to be white European, and in doing so to see themselves as racial kin with white Americans. In fact, the impulse to cleave to Aryan identity is a project which is distinctly racial and explicitly European. There's a clear history of Iranian mythology in which the ancient concept of Arya, originally meaning noble and over time taking on a distinctly classed and racialized connotation, is deliberately connected to the European, quote, Aryan identity, which was later associated with Nazi ideology. That push to associate with European Aryanness rather than Proto-Indo-Iranian, which is a language group, by the way. Aryan was a language group, not a racial group until the Nazis got to it, was led by the Pahlavi monarchs in order to politically align with Europe for their own distinct state-building and geostrategic objectives. Moreover, such a project serves the purpose of distinguishing Iranian identity from Arab, Afghan, and African identity in order to argue that Iranians are part of Western civilization and thus should be afforded what Du Bois called the wages of whiteness. There are very few scholarly studies of the racial identity of Iranian Americans of Americans of Middle Eastern descent, still fewer on Iranian Americans. Some are geographically limited to such an extent that the sample size is small. Generalizability to Iranian American identity as a whole is virtually impossible. For example, Chaichian in 97, Mostofi in 2003, many others. There are a lot of really good ones, but they are limited. Still others focus on certain narrow age groups, such as adolescents, within the specific subset of second-generation Iranian Americans. Some of those even more narrow by geographic location, like Los Angeles. Though it is one such generationally and geographically specific ethnographic study, nevertheless, the precarity of the racial position of Iranian Americans is further illuminated by Neda Mahboubleh's groundbreaking study and really excellent book, if you haven't read it, The Limits of Whiteness, of Iranian American youth in Southern California who express their uncertain racial identity and the anxiety that it can cause. Mahbouleh's study shows that Iranian Americans not only inhabit this in-between liminal zone, but also are largely aware of their collective position. Mahbouleh extends existing arguments about the ability of immigrant groups to jump the color line into whiteness by suggesting that they can also regress back into non-white status under certain circumstances. After September 11th, 2001, and the intensification of public distrust and vilification of Muslims, Iranians were once again treated with public suspicion. Those read as Muslim were again targeted for hate crimes at a higher rate. Bita Baghoulizadeh shows that non-Black Iranians' conceptions of themselves as Aryan is a central fact in the othering of Afro-Iranians, as well as their prejudice against people of African descent globally. Historically, quote from Baghoulizadeh, as Iranians viewed themselves as more and more white, they viewed Africans as more and more Black. Again, race and racialization being not only contingent but relational, oppositional identities. Iranian identification with whiteness is a requisite condition for the anti-Black attitudes held by non-Black Iranian Americans. Viewing themselves as white, they may immediately locate themselves within the American racial schema as superior to Black Americans. Baghoulizadeh's work is essential in understanding how Iranian racial formations telegraph outward when Iranians immigrate to the United States and settle here. I want to spend some time here attending to the issue of the racialization of religion. The relationship between racial othering and religious difference is deeply rooted in the US. While the most historically prominent and disturbingly contemporary example is anti-Semitism. Did you all see Elon Musk's new tweets this week caused an uproar? There's also a strong tradition of anti-Catholic sentiment tied to waves of Irish and Italian immigration. Catholics and Jews were designated as foreign, quote, interlopers by the first and second iterations of the Ku Klux Klan, who themselves identify as a distinctly white Christian identity group. There are numerous public depictions of Catholics as untrustworthy and un-American, including during the election of John F. Kennedy to the presidency in 1960. Catholics were often accused of being incapable of being loyal to the US because of the primacy of their loyalty to the Pope. You see, this dual loyalty smear is used against many groups: Catholics, Jews, Iranians, many. In the post-World War II racial landscape of the United States, this is a quote from Joshua Zeitz. The white middle class emerged as a transcendent category, united in its distance from Blackness. Whiteness replaced Catholicism and Judaism, as well as Italian, Jewish, and Irish identity, as the primary political and social tie that bound second and third generation Americans to each other and to other, quote, old stock Americans. Much of this new identity was implicitly rooted in the economic and political privileges that these post-ethnic Americans derived from their newly secure standing as white, chief among them access to suburban housing, higher education, and better paying industrial and white-collar jobs. So we also see the materiality of racial identity. Whiteness is then, again, best understood as political rather than ethnic identity. The process of racialization is thus not only based on phenotypic presentation and public perception of ethnic affiliation, but also on familial religious background, which I'll get to in a second with my slides for the data. Race and religion are not analytically distinct and are assessed within that context in this study. Religion is both a constitutive element of race in the United States and a selective criterion of racialization. For example, while not treated by official church institutions as mainstream Christians, Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses have not publicly been perceived to be or treated as non-white the way, for instance, Catholics have been. Similarly, other sects of Christianity like Methodists, Protestants, Baptists, etc., sometimes experience tensions or disagreements with one another, but they do not racialize each other as non-white, as outsiders to that group. Catholics have now achieved white collective identity as successive predominantly Catholic immigrant groups, for example, Irish, Italian, moved across the color line into whiteness. Some scholars have documented how Jews became white, like Karen Brodkin, while others have suggested that Americans of Latino descent are currently undergoing this process, for example, Foley. A dear colleague of mine and I are right now in the very early stages of writing a paper comparing the Cuban expat community and the Iranian expat community here in the United States along these lines. Following Mahboubleh's argument regarding the possibility of the loss of whiteness as a collective public racial identity, it is possible that with the resurgence of white nationalism and the rise of neo-Nazi groups in the United States in the recent past, Jews may be experiencing a move back across the color line to lose their racial status. Currently, having undergone the process of racialization on the basis of religious affiliation, Muslims and what I call Muslim adjacent groups in the United States are a visible racial other against which whiteness is posed. A fantastic 2019 article in Critical Criminology, these graphics are from Critical Criminology, by Sarah Beth Kaufman and Hannah Niner, clearly demonstrates that anti-Muslim bias is not an experience of American Muslims as a whole, but by those visibly coded as or read as Muslim, even when they are not. Those are the people I call Muslim adjacent. When what Kaufman and Niner call the corporeality of victimization shows that racialization as other, specifically as Muslim, binds groups from Muslim majority countries or even non-Muslim but interpreted as such countries in their shared experience of anti-Muslim racism based on how they are read by people in their environments. Thus, even non-Muslim Iranians may be othered as Muslims here in the US, irrespective of their actual familial religious background, or even their individually held faith tradition. Their study is in line with others like Lojavardi, Aziz, and Jutti Johal and Singh, among many more, which examine the linkages between religion and racialization among Muslim and Muslim adjacent groups. This brings me to my survey and some of the data that I want to share with you all today. As I said, it's early in the process and I need more data and it's coming in, but I have drawn out some of the strongest links and, to me, most interesting preliminary findings from the survey. First, I want to emphasize that these are very preliminary. I've received 87 surveys out of what I hope to be a minimum of 400. Despite being relatively early in the process, I've been able to pull out some trends that I think are notable, while acknowledging that these may shift as we get more data. For what it's worth, statisticians generally agree that 385 and above is the ideal number for large populations of 10,000 and above, and it doesn't really change from 10,000 to 1 million. So that's how I came to the number of 400. And that's how much money I have in my funding for incentives for participants. So everyone gets a $5 gift card as far as methodology here goes. This is where they responded from. You can see it's a distribution across the country. Here's that chart I was telling you about yesterday that listed the numbers of the top 10 biggest areas, metro areas with Iranian American groups. The areas that were generous with respondents are, unsurprisingly, some of the places where Iranian Americans have settled in the highest concentrations, like Southern California and the New York, Maryland, DC area. I think it's called DMV, right? For those of you who are from the East Coast. You can see here it's broken out by state and by county. Some of the places with no respondents are states that are simply less populated than others, like Montana and Wyoming. But other states like Oklahoma and Michigan have plenty of Iranian Americans. They just haven't responded to my survey yet. I'm working on it. I expect to have this completed by next year. I distributed the surveys by contacting Iranian American civil society organizations and requesting that they send it out to their mailing list. I offered a $5 gift card to respondents who completed the survey and opted in for the incentive at the end of the survey. And the survey is expected to take about 7 to 10 minutes. I want to say that I tried to post it to social media for a bigger and more random sampling, but immediately got flooded by thousands of AI-powered bots. So I had to start the data collection over and be much more selective about the channels of distribution. So just FYI, if you ever want to take on a project like this in the future, I highly recommend against using Twitter and LinkedIn and Facebook and Instagram and whatever. It presents a challenge for sampling, but otherwise they're bots. They're not real people. They saw the $5 and they went, ha, I got this. The mean respondent age was 42, with a wide range of folks from their 20s to their 70s. This is the breakdown of how important respondents said their ethnic heritage is to their daily life. The interesting part of this for me is that the vast majority, above 80%, answered between 7 to 10 on a 1 to 10 scale, where 1 is not at all and 10 is extremely. Here's the breakdown of respondents by recency of immigration. The biggest group was people born and raised in the United States, followed by those who immigrated directly from Iran without living in another country first, 41 or more years ago. Racial self-identification, broken out by recency of immigration, looked like this. Everyone who left Iran and lived in another country first before coming to the US identified as Middle Eastern or Southwest Asian North African. I'm going to abbreviate that as Middle East / SWANA for the rest of this part of the presentation for brevity's sake. 8% identified as Asian. Oh, sorry, wait. That was the next line. So all of them identified as Middle East SWANA who lived in another country and then came here. This is notable because it might tell us something about how experiences in other countries, particularly when they're going to other Middle Eastern countries first, or if they're going to Europe and then coming here, how they may be othered there before coming here. Of the people who immigrated here 41 or more years ago, 1/3 identified as white, 58% as Middle East / SWANA, and 8% as Asian. Respondents who had been here 41 years or more were 75% more likely to identify as Middle East SWANA than white, whereas respondents who were born and raised in the US were about 5.5 times more likely to identify as Middle East SWANA than white. That gap is huge. To me, what this suggests is that if you came here from Iran as an adult with your racial identity and your global worldview largely established, you are much more likely to see yourself as white in accordance with Iranian racial schema. If you are born and raised here but still possibly experience or observe the othering that calls into question your membership as an insider in American society, you're much more likely to see yourself as Middle East Swana, even though you were born here. It's a little paradoxical, no?
Mhm.
You might assume that being born and raised here would make you feel more white if you belong to a sort of in-between ethnic group, because this is a white majority country still. But what we see here is the exact opposite. However, respondents who were third generation or more Americans, and those whose family had been here so long that they weren't sure when they came from Iran, exclusively identified as white. This may be because they felt so far removed from Iranian cultural practices that they had pretty much completely assimilated. This is out of total respondents' experiences of racial discrimination. I asked if they've ever experienced it at all. The majority said yes at 60%, followed by unsure at 26% and no at 14%. On the right is of those that responded yes, the frequency of that experience, with almost 3 out of 4 saying sometimes or rarely. Predictable that a lot and a very little would be the less common. Now, the experiences of racial discrimination by recent Soviet immigration. To me, this is very interesting, and this connects with the data that I was talking about this slide of who identifies as what. The 2 largest groups by recent Soviet immigration were US born and raised, and 41 years or more since immigration directly from Iran. And those 2 groups are the ones, since they had the most respondents. I broke those out here in these pie charts. About the question of whether or not they've ever experienced racial discrimination. You can see that those who were born and raised here are significantly more likely to report that they have experienced racial discrimination in comparison with those who came directly from Iran to the US 41 or more years ago. Many more of those on the right who came here 41 or more years ago are unsure. It's interesting because it raises questions of how discrimination is legible by people acculturated inside and outside of the United States. These charts show how many respondents report having experienced religious discrimination. The red is yes at 40%, purple is no at 37%, and blue is unsure at 33%. Of those that responded yes, about 7 in 10 responded either sometimes or rarely. Again, it's expected that frequently and only once or twice would be smaller proportionally than the middle options. About 2/3 of Shia and 2/3 of Sunni respondents answered yes to this question. 44% of Jewish respondents said yes, with 22% saying no and 33% saying unsure. 50% of Baha'i and 1/3 of Christians said yes. This is religious discrimination by racial identity. When we break down the responses about experiences of religious discrimination by their racial identity, an interesting pattern seems to emerge. These are normalized by percentage, meaning these bars are shown as a percentage of responses rather than the total count, since racial identification wasn't equally distributed across all categories. Respondents identifying as white are most likely not to have experienced religious discrimination, whereas respondents identifying as Middle Eastern Swana were most likely to have said yes, they have experienced religious discrimination. Black respondents said no, whereas non-white, mixed race, Asian, and other respondents were all most likely to report yes, they have experienced religious discrimination. 70% of my respondents reported having experienced discrimination on the basis of their ethnic identity, with 80% of those who said yes reporting sometimes and rarely, again with frequently and no being the least likely responses. The 70% was notable. When 7 in 10 respondents of Iranian descent feel that they have been discriminated against on the basis of their ethnic or Iranian identity, while so many Iranians promote a narrative of Aryanness or whiteness, that is a tension that begs for further investigation. Across the board, respondents were unlikely to have experienced vandalism or hate crimes, but those that did were most likely to say that it was on the basis of their ethnic identity as opposed to their racial or religious identities. This slide gets to some of the questions I was the most curious about going into this. Which ethnic groups within Iran are more likely to report white or Middle East Swana identities in the US? I expected to see that the majority group in Iran, Fars, would be most likely to identify as white here because they were accustomed to being the majority group, and would see themselves that way. I was wrong. The biggest group of respondents here were Fars, Azeri, and Kurd. Fars respondents were less likely than Azeris to identify as white and about the same as Kurds, but Kurds were way more likely to identify as Middle East or Swana. This is a breakdown of two interesting to me questions. I know these are kind of small, so let me talk about it. I want to explain both of these graphs a little bit. On the left, we have racial self-identification broken out by how others in your environment identify you racially. So here we see white self-identifying respondents slightly more likely to be identified as Middle East Swana by others than white. Middle East Swana identifying respondents are overwhelmingly likely to be perceived as such by others. Those who consider themselves non-white are 67% likely to believe others perceive them as Middle East Swana, etc. Those whose perceptions by others are most likely to be in line with their own self-identification are Black, Asian, and mixed race respondents. Those identifying as other believe that they are seen as Middle East Swana by folks in their environment. On the right, I made the colors, I wish that this were a little bit bigger. Let me see if I can make this bigger for a second. I can't right here, but I will. I can bring these up at the end by themselves so that you can see those a little more clearly. I was hoping that the projector would be bigger and you could see it more clearly. I made the colors on the right one gradations of the same color, shades of the same color to indicate sort of severity from 1 to 10. Respondents who say that their self-identification doesn't match with how others perceive them, reporting how much distress that causes them, that discord between how they identify and how others identify them. I try to make this color, again, this gradation, hopefully you can see it. Over half of white respondents, bless you, rated a 1 or a 2 in comparison with Middle East Swana at only 29% rating a 1 or a 2. I'm really interested to see how this fleshes out when I get more data. This is the last slide here of charts and graphics. Although it's the third to last slide. Second to last with the actual graphics. It's another relationship I was extremely curious about going in. How do Iranian Americans identify racially, and what is the linkage between that and whether they feel they are more Iranian, more American, or equally both, somewhere between? Of those who identify as Iranian, 18% self-identify as white, but 76%, more than 3 in 4, as Middle East Swana, and only 6% as other. Of those who feel they are mostly Iranian, we see 13% identify as white, 80% as Middle East Swana, and 77% as other. When we go to equally Iranian and American, which is that one right there, we see the introduction of folks who identify as mixed race at 21%, with Middle East Swana at 58% and white at 13%. Among mostly American Iranian Americans, we jump to 1/3 identifying as white, so Americanness associated with whiteness in people's minds. 42% as Middle East Swana, and 8% each Black, non-white, and mixed race. So then we get to those who identify as fully American. They are 100% likely to be mixed race, interestingly. Those who say other or none of the above are 50% mixed race, 1/4 non-white, and 1/4 white. A note on religion. Agnostic atheists were much more likely to consider themselves equally Iranian and American at 51.5% in that category. Shia Muslims were most likely to consider themselves equally Iranian and American, or fully Iranian at 45 and 32%. People with Baha'i familial religious background were the likeliest group to report that their familial religious affiliation was extremely important to their daily lives at 100%. Followed by Zoroastrian at 2/3 and agnostic atheists at 41%. When it came to individual religious affiliation, that trend shifted significantly. Baha'is dropped completely, with no individuals reporting that they practice that faith tradition now. Indeed, the total count reporting as agnostic atheists went from 17 to 33% when moving from familial to individual religious affiliation. meaning that a lot of people dropped their familial religious background to become atheists. This is in keeping with the trend across the region of the decline of religiosity. Shia Muslims went from 67 familial to 31 individual. The group within individual religious affiliation reporting the highest level of importance of ethnic heritage in daily life was Catholic at 50%, followed by other at 37% and Shia Muslim at 26%. The relationship between racial identification and familial religious background was interesting. Agnostic atheist respondents were equally likely to identify as white, Middle East Swana, and mixed race. Shia Muslims, by far the biggest group in the familial religious background category, identified as Middle East Swana at 58%, far and away the largest group, followed by white at 18%. 2/3 of Jewish respondents identified as Middle East Swana, as well as 1/3 of Christian respondents. Okay, this brings us to concluding thoughts. The relationship between religious affiliation and identification as Middle East Swana versus white is a very complex one, and one that has thus far not seen a whole lot of empirical study. There is a really interesting study that was published just last year, authored by Neda Mahboudeh, Ariella Schachter, and Renee Flores, about tendencies to identify what they term MENA, Middle East North African, versus white in the broader context of the US Census, with the overall goal for them of advocating for the addition of a MENA option on the US Census for future iterations. What was the most fascinating to me about that study was the methodology. They used names specific to the countries that they were referencing when interviewing their subjects online that were easily recognizable as, say, Iranian, Moroccan, etc., as well as ancestry and religion to differentiate MENA, white, and black categories, and they asked for self-identification and external categorization. They also used language. Their study showed a somewhat expected interaction between religious identity and tendency to identify as white. Those who identified as Muslim were much more likely to identify as MENA. Predictable, right? Those who identified as Christian were most likely to identify as either MENA or both MENA and white over exclusively white. Their findings seem to suggest that whiteness and Christianity are linked for Americans of Middle East Swana origins, and Islam and MENA identity are linked. This is also notable in light of the fact that 2/3 of Arab Americans are Christian. Also, when they looked at the interaction between racial identity and the classification of others based on skin tone, they found that MENA respondents were more likely to classify individuals with light and medium skin tones as MENA over darker skin tones, whereas white individuals really only saw medium skin tones as MENA. So in other words, white respondents see whiteness in the skin tones in a different way. The study is exciting, but it's somewhat limited. Again, we have sample size issues. It was a convenient sample. It wasn't really nationally representative. And I think that's what they're working on for future studies as well. Excuse me. However, this pattern, you might be wondering why I have a hinge here. This pattern is totally in keeping with the racial hinge theory that Mahboudeh has written about before, especially in that fantastic book I mentioned, The Limits of Whiteness. There's a history of Iranian ethnicity being used as a racial hinge against which Arabs and South Asians measured their race in court cases in which they argued that they should be allowed the right to naturalization in the United States, which at the time was exclusive to white Americans. Until 1952, federal law provided naturalization rights only to individuals who were white or black, but nothing in between. Americans of Arab and South Asian descent were forced to prove in court that they were either white or black in order to gain citizenship. Presumably, individuals with phenotypic presentations that were closer to white than black argued in favor of their whiteness. Arab Americans often argued that they were white on the basis of their stark difference from Iranian Americans, whose identities they presumed to be non-white. They referred to Iranians as these kind of pagan fire eaters, and they said, look at us, we're civilized, we're not like those Iranians, we're white. Whereas Americans of South Asian descent often argued that they should be extended naturalization rights on the basis of their strong similarity with Iranians, whom they saw as unequivocally white. This recent history as a racial hinge is reflected in these current tensions over which side of the color line to stand for Iranian Americans. The tendency of non-Black individuals of Iranian descent in the United States to identify with whiteness in spite of a racial status that is both politically contingent and profoundly liminal may represent an extension of the Iranian nationalist project of the 20th century. The use of ethno-religious identities as a basis for a nation state is a modern and Eurocentric phenomenon and was promulgated by European colonial powers in the service of their own imperial interests in the Middle East. Laura Robeson and Ari Dubnov have written about this extensively. Robeson's book, States of Separation, is fantastic. I highly recommend it. The Pahlavi monarchy's desire to compete with European powers provided an impetus for this decision to promote the myth of an essentially Aryan identity for Iranians, aligning more closely with Europe and distancing Iran from other nations in the region. Taken together, these elements function as an ideological and social foundation for white identity for non-Black Iranians, which is activated and mobilized when they immigrate to the United States, finding themselves in a social context which systematically disadvantages Blackness and elevates whiteness. While there have been qualitative studies of specific subgroups of the Iranian American population, critical arguments about the precarity of Iranian American identity, and quantitative or mixed method studies of Iranian immigrants in, say, Europe, there has not been a comprehensive nationwide study of the collective racial identity of the Iranian diaspora in the United States. The quantitative element of this study aims to empirically and systematically assess the character of racial identification among Iranian Americans, evaluate the extent to which they self-identify as white, and analyze the various factors contributing to their collective group identity, including socioeconomic status, religion, religious faith, recency of immigration, etc. The aim of this research is to reveal insights about Iranian society, the promises and challenges of making a new home for immigrants to the United States, and the relationship between the process of racialization and the social functions of nationalism. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Razavi. That was just so informative. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. We have time for questions. We're going to have one question from the audience who's here present, quote unquote, physically, and then we're going to go with the Zoom question. So let's go with a question from the audience. Anyone has any questions? Unless you're thinking about your question, then I'd probably go to the Zoom question. Yeah, should I go with it? Okay, let's go with the Zoom question. The first one is, giving us several. Let me go with Matt Evans. I'm going to read this out loud. I feel like Ignatieff's discussion of the Irish becoming white offers some functionalist undertones in offering a machine politics explanation of the way the placement of the Irish into the space of Tammany Hall constituency helps various Democratic Party elites and the political machine itself. Is a similar functionalist undertone to an explanation of some of these Iranian shifts into whiteness, perhaps in serving a shared Christian and Muslim fundamentalist rigid vision of gender or something else? Were you able to get that?
That's a very interesting question. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, Matt, and hello, old friend, my grad school compatriot.
Right.
I think that this gets back to the question of whether or not that process is happening in a similar way with Iranians as compared to folks like Irish immigrants. And as far as the political machine, I do think that there are crucial similarities, and we are seeing some alignment with, I hesitate to say that this is unique to Iranian Americans because we have this among all immigrant groups, but there is this cleavage in which there are some sort of hard right shifts among some Iranian Americans who are like Bijana Kian. I don't know if you've ever heard this name. He's a little bit under the radar. He was a close associate of Michael Flynn, and he, like Flynn, was indicted for the various kind of crimes associated with foreign lobbying without disclosing and things like that. He's a kind of a under the radar but very important political figure. So people like this are they are, I think, trying to engineer this position in similar ways as Matt is referring to for Iranian Americans, and they're doing so on the basis of a sincerely held belief that it's true. that the similarity between Iranians and white Americans is so much that there's no significant distinction. And I think those political the functions within the political machine are being created from scratch along the way. I don't think that there's a systematic self-conscious effort on the part of most, but for some, like Kian, like Shahryar Ahi, people associated with Reza Pahlavi, a lot of them, I think the answer is yes for them.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
We have a few more questions from chat. If there's not a question here, maybe I could, okay, yes, please, go ahead.
A clarification question in a way. But when you're looking at the Pahlavi, monarchy, and you spoke about the whiteness and the European effect, do you believe, I think you said this, but the youth during that time was heavily influenced by wanting this European persona, that when they came to the United States, it was something that was more of an achievement and goal that they had to pursue?
Yeah,
Maybe I can just
please go
say that in the chat. So the point was about the youth in the Pahlavi era who migrated to the US,
Yes.
right? Whether they carried that myth
Right.
of the Aryan nationalism with them here, and of course it got regenerated and reproduced with the new generation perhaps. So that's the question.
I think I hesitate to make generalizations about Iranian youth in the Pahlavi period. It's a little bit outside of I don't have like hard data on that. But from what I've read, yes, absolutely, there was a connection there, and I don't think that it was necessarily, again, like self-conscious and driven in a deliberate way. I think that there are a lot of myths of nation building that get promulgated from the top down, and they trickle out, and they are often internalized without people really being aware or reflecting on whether it's valid or not. It just becomes part of the national ethos and the mythos of the nation. And I think that it's very easy for Iranians to fall into that because they have seen themselves as distinct from their neighbors ethnically and otherwise for hundreds and maybe longer of years. In fact, the way that Iran became Shia in a very Sunni neighborhood, it was specifically for the purpose of defense of the state. The Safavis at the time, who were in power, they looked around and they saw the marauding Ottomans over there in what's now Turkey, and the Afghans and the Arabs, they're all Sunni. So they converted Iran to Shiism at the tip of a sword in order to, it was one of those early attempts at building a cohesive oppositional national identity that would differentiate them from others, because they otherwise worried that Iranians would just say, "Hey, brother, come on in," when they saw the invading soldiers, right? Because they saw themselves as part of this global ummah. So I think that kind of background really cues up these attitudes among the youth in the Pahlavi period about their distinctness. And although that was religious, there are ethnic dimensions to that as well. So coming to the United States as an achievement, that's definitely, I think that's true, but I think the reasons behind that are multifaceted. Part of it probably is owing to this kind of issue of identity. Part of it is just that among immigrants from much of the world, it's been an aspiration for a long time. I think probably until it started to decline a little bit recently. Aspirations to come to the United States are really high all over the world. So I don't know that that's necessarily distinct for Iranian youth during the Pahlavi period.
Yes, please, go ahead. Actually, there's actually not a question. Go ahead.
So my question was kind of about what you mentioned at the end about how Iranian identity was kind of used as an info for people around the area as like they're not white, we're whiter than them.
Right.
They are white, we're white. Were there Iranian at the time also arguing for naturalization, or sort of what kind of arguments were they using?
So there was a very prominent case of an Iranian Armenian who made that case, and they were basically saying that we are white and we should therefore be accorded the rights of citizenship. And I don't have off the top of my head, I don't remember the name of the case, but certainly it was being argued by Iranians as well. But it's interesting that all of these cases were they were in tension with each other as far as what arguments they were making and what place Iranians had within the argument. Yeah.
I'll let you read some of the chats later. You don't want to shut down. There's the comment by Chat Chance, but let me briefly ask you this question. Going back to the quote unquote mother or fatherland, whatever you want to call it, the Aryan race theory was certainly institutionalized, in particular from the 1920s onwards. But it was not, an interesting thing to know, it's not a pervasive ideology, especially in the 60s and 70s, where in the class line, you got many Iranian segments of Iranian population who simply did not accept it. And you're looking at a class segment that was relatively religious and came from a working class background. I'm wondering, and this probably relates to the question that was asked, whether that got translated to the immigrant Iranians who came here as well. If you notice that, it seems like to me this is a very typical middle class Iranian understanding of race coming from Iran to here.
Yeah.
But again, I may be wrong. You know, still the question of Aryanness in Iranian identity is, to me, is a big question. I still can't figure out exactly how many Iranians actually believe it.
I mean, I think a lot of people do.
Yeah.
I haven't gotten enough. I didn't specifically ask in the survey, do you think you're Aryan? You know what I mean? Because I wrote the questions in such a way as to just sort of drill down on people's identities as a whole and not lead them to believe that I'm trying to figure out if they want to be white or not, you know? So, but I can tell you that in conversations that I've had over the years, and this is the case across class lines. I have observed a lot of people who come here expecting to be treated as white, and when they are not, it is very confusing. And they adapt to that tension in various ways. Some of them double down on the sort of anti-Black racism that they have probably long held, because they see themselves again back in Iran as white. So then they come here and they're like, why are these people not treating me as if I'm one of them? Why are they being racist towards me when I'm the same race as them? So I think it is a distinctly, I think it's a deeply held belief among Iranians. I don't have numbers on how many of them believe that, but as part of the kind of national ethos, I think a lot to some degree. I have, I mean, a lot of this, I don't want to get into like blood quantum and stuff, right? But I have in my own extended family, I have members of my family who go and they do these like 23andMe ancestry kind of DNA tests. And on the basis of that, then they've made decisions about whether or not they present themselves to other people as Iranian or not. I've even had a couple of family members change their names as a result of those. Yeah.
Of course, the idea behind that is that genetics is somehow fundamentally linked to race.
Right.
The social category.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question from the audience. By the way, there's a lot of praise here in the chat, and of course, I'm sure everyone will share the sentiments here as well. But if there's no other question, is there? Okay, one more question, yes, please.
I was wondering, because you mentioned talk about like people crossing color and stuff. I was wondering if there's any questions about like wondering about how mixed race people identify as far as color lines go.
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if I have it in here. Let me look and see. Yeah, so on the left here, I'm sorry, I know it's small. I really thought the projector was going to be bigger. This question is broken out. It's how do you identify and how do you think other people perceive you? So so this one isn't, I'd have to go dig into I have a bunch more graphics of how these break down, so I can answer your question in more detail maybe afterward, after we disconnect the Zoom and all the shared screen and all that. But there is a big proportion that do identify as mixed race. I didn't ask mixed with what though. I didn't ask mixed with white or mixed with Black or mixed with other, you know. But it's a very interesting question, and I'm hoping that I'm going to get more, as I get more data, I'll get more trends that I can pull out on these questions of mixed race Iranians. Which, by the way, I know this it's not what you asked, but it's related. Have you recently learned the term Nimruni. Have you heard this term before?
What's that?
Nimruni.
Nimruni?
Yeah. So it's just
Oh,
sort
it's
of
like
funny.
Sushi, like half and half?
Like half a like
You know sushi, like Shia and Sunni getting married, they call them sushi.
I didn't know that. That's so funny. Did you know that? Wow. It's like that. It's like Nim Iranian, half Iranian, they call themselves Nimruni. So it's really funny, right? I love that. I didn't know about the sushi phrase. I'm gonna have to incorporate that.
I've not been able to eat sushi like that after I heard that, yeah. I think we're running out of time, so thank you so much. Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
for having me.
That was
My pleasure.
fantastic. And people in chat, thank you so much, and this recording will be posted online later. Thank you so much, everyone.